everybody, my name's Anne. I am your instructor for Ethics Philosophy 208, and I am so excited that we're all in this class together. I'm making this video to talk to you about cultural ethical relativism. It's one of the main topics for week 1, and this is the only video, or my first video that I've ever made. So if I come across as weird, don't worry, I actually am. Most philosophers are weird in some way or another, so just take that for granted and move on. Okay, so what's ethics? Ethics is the philosophical study of morality. Morality is the practice of evaluating actions, people, and institutions in moral ways. And we do this all the time without even thinking about it. As soon as we say that, hey, she should have done that, or he shouldn't have done that at all. I mean, that was just completely the wrong thing to do. Well, you have made, as soon as you say something like that, or even think something like that, you have made a moral judgment. And we do this all the time. It's part of how we get along in the world. It's just part of the makeup of how we work. Now, in ethics, we ask questions about whether these moral decisions we're making are legit, if we have good, solid reasons to back them up or not. So we make these moral judgments all the time, and often we don't think about the reasons the reasons really deep behind them, right? Most often we leave it at things like, well, that's the way I was taught. That's what I hear in church, or, that's what, everybody else around me is doing that. So it seems to be the case that that's, what we should be doing. Well, maybe that's the right thing or not, but in ethics, we don't stop at those reasons. We got to think about it harder. So ethics is one of the subcategories of philosophy. There's many different topics in philosophy that we can talk about. There's philosophy of history. There's epistemology, which is basically the studying of knowledge itself. There's, you can study philosophy from a historical point of view. There's philosophy of science, and then each science has its own philosophy of, like, philosophy of physics, philosophy of chemistry, philosophy of, insert that. There's philosophy of sports, philosophy of sex and love, philosophy of, and it goes on and on and on. Philosophy is really the first science because philosophy is the art or the science of thinking well. It's the human brain at its best, right, is what the philosopher is going for. So we have to be completely logical. In philosophy, what do we use? We use the evidence that we have at our disposal, and we use logic and critical thinking. And so, critical thinking, that's one of the big things that we can study in philosophy, and it's a really important thing. Actually, it's the philosopher's method is the critical thinking. We think everything through. Philosophers are those weird people that can and do argue even with themselves. And my husband just kind of stares at me when I go into that. Sometimes I do it out loud, or sometimes I just stop and stare at the ceiling because now I'm arguing with myself and I'm not sure. And I can argue both sides, or any side, there's lots of different perspectives. And so we can't, or at least I can't, let go of any of them. I got to keep thinking about all these different perspectives. So my area of specialty in philosophy is ethics. But let's see, I also have specialized in logic, because that's so much fun for me. Let's see, what else? Feminist philosophy, that's important to me, and American pragmatism. There's philosophy in the Western tradition. That's what we'll be thinking about philosophy in the Western tradition. What that means is the philosophy that started like in ancient Greece about 2,500 years ago, and then it comes to us through a tradition of thinkers that are in Western Europe and so forth. There's also Eastern philosophy. I'm sorry, I know absolutely nothing about it. It's taught as a completely different subject in the American educational system, and I just have never had a chance to learn anything about that. But I encourage you to look into it if you'd like. I'm sure there's stuff on the web that you can find about that. Oh yeah, okay. So when you look for information on the web about philosophy, there is the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a pretty good place for you to start if you want to find more information. And I'll put that in an announcement or something. Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's written at a level that most people are going to be able to understand. At this point, if I were you, I would stay away from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's written for graduate students in philosophy and for basically philosophy professors. So it's pretty heavy duty, and they take a lot of things for granted and don't explain everything. But the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy explains most everything that they have to say, so it's a pretty good resource. You can always look things up on Wikipedia, but you can't trust Wikipedia as a source. It's always a place. I even look at Wikipedia. It's a place to start, but that's never the place that you finish, because, well, there's so many hands in that that dish or whatever, that we're not really sure, or you can't be positive that the information there is completely accurate. I know that they're trying to work on Wikipedia and make the information more accurate, and I think that's awesome. But never use that as a source in a paper. And if you use it as a source for personal knowledge, continue and look up things, because you can't stop there. That's not going to be a trustworthy source in and of itself. Okay, so we're talking about ethics, and we're talking about cultural ethical relativism. And by the time that you say that a few times, or at least by the time that I say that a few times, I will have messed up. It's kind of a tongue twister, or at least it is for me. So I want to talk first about cultural relativism as it shows up in like your anthropology class, maybe even in your sociology class. Cultural relativism in itself is a great idea. I learned about it in the anthropology class that I took at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Oh gosh, probably 20 years ago now. And it's a really important idea, right? It tells you that you need to learn, and you need to think, and you need to just kind of like absorb information when you come into contact with another culture, with a person from another culture, or if you go to the other culture, if you make snap judgments, you're just going to be wrong, because in different cultures there can be different traditions that are very rich, and it's, you can't just understand them just off the cuff. You got to really think about it, and you got to study, and you got to watch people. And cultural relativism tells you that just that, you have to accept the other culture before you can understand it. And it takes a long time to understand another culture. Sometimes it can take a long time to even understand subcultures within a given society. And for instance, in the society that we call the United States of America, there's many subcultures. And I would say that I know everything about each subculture. Since I've lived in the United States most of my life, I've only been out of the country a few times, then I'm pretty familiar with the subcultures, but I need to be a cultural relativist when I come in contact with people that I don't know their traditions completely well, right? And so that idea of cultural relativism is really important, and it's not the idea that we're talking about in ethics. The problem, or a problem comes into being when we try to use cultural relativism as an ethical theory. And an ethical theory is a normative ethical theory that tells you, or it's an attempt to tell you what you should or should not do. So if you try to use ethical relativism, the idea that, ideas and practices and ways of life are relative to different cultures, and you try to make that into a moral theory, that's what we're talking about with cultural ethical relativism. And as I will explain to you, while it's a really tempting idea as an ethical theory, it has a lot of problems with it. And so it's not the most fruitful way of looking at ethics. And so that's one of the things we'll be really looking at in this first week of our class. Okay, so when we talk about people from moral perspectives, we say that they're good or bad, compassionate or cruel, or those kinds of words. And then we can separate from people to carry out actions, right? And we can say of actions that they're right or wrong, that they're morally obligatory, morally permissible, morally forbidden. When we say morally permissible, we mean from a moral perspective, you're allowed to do it. I mean, it's just permissible means, you can do it, but you don't necessarily have to. Morally obligatory, you're obliged. Yeah, have to do that from a moral perspective. And morally forbidden, from a moral perspective, you're not allowed to do that thing, whatever it is that we're talking about. So those are the kinds of words that philosophers use. We're getting into those realms of thought whenever you say that somebody should or should not do something. Whenever the word should comes up, now you're talking about morality, whether you realize it or not. Ought or ought not do something, that's the same kind of thing. We can phrase it in different ways, but when you're thinking about what people should or should not do, whatever phrasing you're using, well, that's when you're talking about ethics. Okay, so cultural ethical relativism. It's a normative ethical theory that tells you that it's an attempt to tell you that what is right is what a given culture says is right. And that's all there is to it. It's just whatever a culture says, that's the right thing to do. So if we can separate off different cultures, and we'll say, okay, here's culture A, here's culture B, here's culture C. The people who live in culture A actually should do whatever is determined that they should do within that culture. And there's no other truth to the matter. People in culture B should do what the culture, say, overarching culture in culture B says they should do, right? And the same for culture C. And this ethical theory, right? Cultural ethical relativism is an attempt to say that that's where morality comes from. That's what people should do, is what their own culture says. Okay, so I wasn't the one who made up the theory, and that's true with all these things that we'll talk about this semester. I didn't make up any of them, and so I'm the messenger, right? Remember, don't shoot the messenger. And but anyway, so cultural ethical relativism is an ethical theory that tells you that what is right or wrong is what your own culture says is right or wrong. So from the perspective of a cultural ethical relativist, what should you do? You should do what your own culture says. Simple as that. Now, determining what your culture says you should do, that's going to be one of the tricksy parts, right? Because not everybody in a given culture agrees. And so then it becomes difficult to say, well, what does this culture say we should do? For instance, there are a lot of issues in the United States that, about 50% of people think one way and 50% of people think another way. And the two sides don't look like they're ever going to agree on that. And in fact, I should say this, by the way, throughout this whole class and throughout the field of ethics, the objective is never to force you to agree with somebody else's position. Actually, it's kind of the complete opposite. The point of ethics is to get you to think the issue through for yourself, using your own brain, your own evidence, your own logic, all the stuff that you have to think for yourself, right? So that's the goal of ethics, is to get you to think for yourself about what's morally right or wrong, and for you to think through and give the good and important reasons for yourself. Now, ultimately, it would be great if we all agree. And if we ever really come up with an excellent moral theory, maybe we all will agree with it. But philosophers and many others, have been trying to give this ultimate ethical theory for about 2,500 years, if not longer. We only have records of what philosophers have said for about the last 2,500 years. Of course, there were philosophers before that, but we've pretty much lost what they said. I have a book of what the philosophers before 2,500 years ago said. It's about yay thick, and only about half of that yay thickness is actually what those philosophers wrote. So it's unfortunate it's just been lost, maybe they didn't write it down, or maybe we've lost those writings. But we've been able to keep track, luckily, for about 2,500 years about what philosophers are thinking on these things. So different philosophers. In this class, we're going to look at utilitarianism, which is an idea that comes into play in the 1800s. Jeremy Bentham came up with the idea of utilitarianism. You're going to learn about that later. And then John Stuart Mill is a really important character who picks up the idea of utilitarianism, and he really argues for it in the 1800s, and he lives in England. And he writes in English, which makes his philosophy, or his work in philosophy, a lot easier to read than some other philosophers. Oh, by the way, I should tell you, philosophy is really hard to read. Leave a lot of time to read it. Often I have to read it multiple times. And I've been studying philosophy for over 20 years because I love it. It is the good stuff. It's like, brain candy. But it's not easy. You gotta really think about it. You gotta read it twice, 3 times. I underline, I take notes, I write in the margins, and I go back and I read it again. It's not easy stuff. And then every time you read it, maybe you're going to think of something else. So always take notes when you read philosophy. So this cultural ethical relativism, let's get back to that. Yes, I can get off on tangents. I try not to. Midgley is one of the people that we're reading this week, talking about cultural ethical relativism. You get to read it for yourself, so I'm not going to spoil that for you. But what she talks about is, one of the issues she talks about is moral isolationism. Is it even possible to understand another culture? And our own culture in the United States of America says yes, because we are a bunch of people. Our descendants come from all over the world, and we have come to understand each other pretty well. I mean, yeah, there's some misunderstandings in our culture, but all things considered, from all the different backgrounds we come from, we have developed a culture where we understand each other. So yes, it is possible to understand another culture, but we have to spend a lot of time and energy to do so. Now, if we want to say that what is right is what a culture says is right, well, there are some logical problems with that. If you state the level of description, that would be the idea of cultural relativism that you're going to find in your anthropology class. that is fine. There's no problems there. It's true that in different cultures, people dress differently, they eat different foods, they have different practices. They even have different ideas about morality, and that's true, right? And if you stay at that level of description, there is no problem. That's just, you're just talking about facts. When you make it into an ethical theory that says, well, what you should do is what your own culture says that you should do, that's where the logical problems start to seep in. Because there are, for instance, we can just think about American history. At one point in time, slavery was considered, it's hard to say it, but people must have at that time thought it was okay from a moral perspective, or at least some of them did. Enough people thought it was okay that it went on for a long time and nobody stopped it. Today we think of slavery as, just reprehensible and disgusting, and we look down upon the practice. But that's our own culture in the past has condoned this. So if we say that what is right is what our culture says is right, then slavery, during the time that our culture said it was right, it would have actually been right. But if you think about it, we don't think that's true. We think that slavery is actually wrong, independent of what anybody personally thinks of it. Any group of people that think that this is in general what we're thinking nowadays is that slavery is wrong no matter what individuals think about it. We also think that discrimination against groups of people because of whatever characteristic they have. We think of discrimination as wrong no matter what any group of people or individuals happen to think of it. Right? Think about Nazi Germany. It turns out that the German political system was odd at the time. Odd in that somebody could get to power like Hitler with only about 15% of the vote. I'm not a political scientist, I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to let your political science teacher tell you all about how Hitler came to power in Nazi Germany. But anyway, he didn't have that many followers, only about 15% of the vote, right? But he got to take control with that. And of course, then what happened was a lot of Jewish people and other people, a lot of Jewish people, a lot of disabled people, a lot of Catholics, pretty much anybody that Hitler had a problem with. Those are the people that ended up dying in what we now call the Holocaust. And we think, generally, everybody in the world thinks that Hitler was wrong, even if his culture happened to agree with him at that time. And we don't think it matters what percentage of his culture happened to agree with him. We think it's really wrong. The Holocaust was really wrong, and Hitler's ideas were really wrong. But if cultural ethical relativism was a good ethical theory, then the logical conclusion would be to say that, well, in that time and place, Hitler was right, because that's what that culture, or at least a certain percentage of it, maintained was right. So we end up with some odd results if we want to try to use cultural ethical relativism, and we have to be logically consistent when we use a theory, and we can't just pick and choose. We have to think it through, and if you use the theory, you got to use the whole theory. So you can't say, hey, it works in this one little part, and we're going to use it here, and we're going to ignore all these other things. In philosophy, you can't do that. You have to look at the big picture, think logically, consistently across the board, look at all the details, and accept them. This is what your theory says, right? Is if a person happens to agree with cultural ethical relativism, then they also are saying that Hitler was okay because his culture agreed with him. Now, many Germans, I would just point out, did not agree with him at all. Most of them were just scared to death, because it was a regime that was it ran off of fear. But enough of the culture agreed with him that he got away with it for a long time, and a lot of people died. So cultural ethical relativism, as a moral theory, would tell you that what Hitler did was okay. Most of us would say, no, what Hitler did was not okay, which actually means then that we don't think that cultural ethical relativism is a good theory, because when we think it out, we don't follow through with it. We don't think it's a good idea. So these are the kinds of things that you're going to be thinking about for week 1. I have taken up almost a half an hour of your time watching this. I am so glad that you guys are here in the class, and I know we're going to get along famously. I want everybody, you got to, the whole logical thing, you got to think logically, and respect other people's, what they say. You don't have to agree with somebody to be respectful to them. In fact, you can respectfully disagree with somebody. And often that's what philosophers do. We kind of argue with each other or disagree with each other for a living. And this is through time and space. I mean, I can go back and I can write an article that I don't know why I'd want to disagree with Plato. Actually, I think Plato's pretty cool, but he wasn't right about everything. He lived about 2,400 years ago. And I can write an article that disagrees with Plato, right? And I can find some point where perhaps he failed at his logic, or his evidence wasn't correct, or he didn't put them together correctly, and I can disagree with him, but I can also do it respectfully. So the respectfully part is something that we definitely want to remember to do on our discussion board. Don't expect that everybody's going to agree, and remember that that's not even the objective anyway. I hope, if anything, that you come out of this class realizing that, wow, you got a lot of stuff to think about from an ethical point of view. You have to actually question your own beliefs and think them through for yourself. And that's going to be really exciting and a lot of work for you, and I hope that you do it. So please ask any questions that you have. I love to help students. Philosophy is what makes my world go round. Teaching is what makes my world go round. So make sure to ask questions if I can help you in any way. And thank you for watching this. Okay, bye.